What's up, YouTube? Capital G here. So there's been a lot of talks and a lot of discussions in the Yu-Gi-Oh community about the rising price of the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game. I would say specifically when it comes to playing the game competitively, whether it be on the YCS or the regional level, and it's definitely a major concern. That's why you've seen so many Yu-Gi-Tubers talking about this issue. I actually don't think that the problem has plateaued yet, and I'll talk about that a little more in a different video, but there are a lot of budget players out there wondering if there are any options, because it does really feel like the price of your average competitive Yu-Gi-Oh deck has tripled, maybe even quadrupled over the last 3 months. So many expensive staple level cards, Appaloosa, Impermanence, Extravagance, etc., and budget players are wondering if there are any options. Are there any ways that I can keep up? Are there any hidden tech cards out there, some cards that might be under the radar or maybe I just didn't think about? And in this video, I want to cover one of those cards. This is a card that I absolutely love. I played it multiple times in the past at regionals. It has seen fantastic results when I've been able to use it effectively, and it's a card that cost only about $1. So basically anyone watching this video can afford this card, and I think that it just trashes about 90% of the meta. The card I want to discuss in this video is Inspector Border. I really do love this card. I feel like it is 100% in the S tier of stun cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Well, stun monsters anyways. Throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, there's been other amazing stun level monsters, cards like Thunder King Ryo and Fossil Dyna, but I feel like for the new age of Yu-Gi-Oh! Inspector Border is pretty much the gold standard, and I really love how if you drop this guy on the board going first against a combo deck, it really does feel like you don't even give your opponent the opportunity to play the game and do what their deck wants to do. So Inspector Border has always been really strong against combo decks, but right now more so than ever, even when you compare it against other S tier stun monsters like Thunder King Ryo, or as I mentioned earlier, Fossil Dyna, it feels like it covers so much more ground against these combo decks. One of the problems that those cards have historically is sometimes the combo decks will actually have monsters that they can just naturally normal summon that are pretty big monsters, and if they can summon monsters that are 1900 attack, they can actually run over those smaller stun monsters or maybe even crash with them. A prime example would be a deck like Spiral. We all recognize that Spiral is probably the best deck in the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG right now competitively, but they don't have the answer for a card like Inspector Border. Thunder King Ryo in theory should be really strong against Spiral, as they want to search and then do some more searching after the searching. However, if your opponent has something like Spiral Tough, or if they have the Spiral Super Agent, they can just summon, they can crash into the Ryo and then proceed to play as normal. Or with something like Spiral Tough, they could activate the effect, maybe get lucky and just pop it for free. But Inspector Border is that 2000 attack, and there really aren't any combo decks that just play 2000 attack monsters that they can normal summon and crash into the border. This means that Spiral really don't have a good way of being able to out this card. They can't activate Spiral Tough's effect, they can't even special summon Super Agent from their hand. So when Inspector Border hits the field, basically the Spiral player is not gonna have a way of being able to out the card unless it's like game 2 or 3 and they have something specifically boarded in to deal with it. When I looked at the other combo decks in the metagame, Heroes are in a very similar situation. Heroes usually can get the Stratos at will. It's a pretty significant size beater, but not quite big enough to be able to beat over something like Inspector Border. Hell, even if your opponent did happen to have something like Honest Neos in their hand and they had another hero monster with a decent attack, they would not be able to activate the Honest Neos to help you beat over the Inspector Border. So just a little more icing on the cake. I looked at some of the other matchups that are combo based, like Luna Lights. Luna Lights are known for being able to just get a near infinite amount of resources by using the Luna Light Kaleido chick to kind of set their graveyard up, then using Tiger over and over and over again to get them fodder for Xyz summons and Link summons, etc. And one of the things that makes Luna Light so difficult to kind of stop is the fact that it's really hard to stop Kaleido chick and her dumping another Luna Light monster to the graveyard effect, because of course it is a cost. You really can't use something like Ash Blossom, or you can't use effect negation to stop that effect. However, with Inspector Boulder on the field, your opponent cannot even attempt to activate the Kaleido Chick effect. This means they can't even pay the cost of sending that card to the graveyard. And for Lunalights to be able to out this, they basically have to have the perfect combination. They have to have a normal summon, then they have to be able to get a monster from the graveyard with like Perfume or Tiger. It kind of requires them to have like the perfect setup, and I just don't think it's very realistic. Another reason that I really love Inspector Boulder right now is the fact that it answers combo extenders incredibly well. When you look at this format, dangers are still very prolific, whether it be in Lunalights or sometimes in Spirals, Orcus, etc., etc. Danger monsters cannot be activated while you have the Inspector Boulder face up. This doubles down on your Burning Abyss matchup and the effectiveness in that as well. Your opponent can't use things like Gallus. They can't just reveal, a graph, or they can't just reveal the Seer and just special summon it to get monsters on the field to go for those link summons or those Exceed summons, etc., etc. So this is a card that if you happen to drop it against a combo deck, you're basically telling your opponent whatever that normal summon is, that's all you're kind of getting for the turn. All of these natural extenders that you play, these cards that activate in the hand or whatever, none of them are going to be effective, and it really slows combo decks to a standstill, and it puts them in a situation where they're just not able to beat over this card. It kind of becomes caveman Yu-Gi-Oh at that point, but as long as you're keeping the combo deck to one summon, you're almost always going to be at a decisive advantage, and you're going to be in the driver's seat in that matchup. Now that we've established that Inspector Boulder can stomp combo decks into the ground, let's talk about the versatility of this card, because if you happen to run into a control deck, you might be like, it's not going to be all of that good, but you might actually be surprised. There are a lot of options out there for cards that are super effective against combo decks, but then when you try to play them against a control matchup, they're just not very good. Sometimes a card like Nibiru or Dark Ruler No More, you can't even resolve it against Altergeist or Guru Control. This card does not actually have that problem. In fact, let's talk about those two matchups specifically. Inspector Boulder is a card that if you are main decking, you can leave it in the main deck against Altergeist and Guru Control, especially against Altergeist. Altergeist is one of those decks that simply does not have a beater big enough to be able to kill this card, and it really puts a lot of pressure on the Altergeist opponent. Number one, a lot of their best defensive options, cards like Altergeist Protocol or Altergeist Conquery, they just won't work against this card because it's not an activated effect. Also, Conquery is a card that activates in the hand. If your opponent doesn't have that extra deck monster, they're not going to be able to use the Conquery at all. Even if your opponent has one of their best removal cards, an Altergeist Miluseek, if they just summon Miluseek and attack you directly, they can't activate the removal effect of the Miluseek. Even if your opponent thinks that they're smart and they link away the Miluseek for a Link Karibo, thus getting a search for Multi-Faker, if they're able to use a trap card and summon Faker and get Sequidius from the deck, well, now they can't use the Sequidius because they've already used the monster effect for that turn. They also can't even defend themselves with the Link Karibo, so you can just attack into that and they won't be able to use the effect. So generally speaking, it just puts a lot of pressure on Altergeist. The Guru matchup is pretty much the same. In fact, I'd argue that it could even be better because we all know when it comes to Guru, one monster is basically driving the entire ship of that deck, and if they're not able to activate Guru's monster effect, well, what are they really doing at that point? They have to open with Final Battle and hope that you don't have an answer for that to be able to beat over the Inspector Boulder. Also, when Guru flips over something like there can only be one, that's not very effective because Inspector Boulder is a machine type monster, so if you're just splashing it into a deck, it's very unlikely that it's really going to stop you all of that much. Lastly, I think when it comes to control decks, we got to look at the Salamangreat matchup. I know Salamangreat is kind of in that middle ground between combo and control, but Salamangreat are just absolutely destroyed by this card. Salamangreat are one of the archetypes that can easily go into extra deck monsters because any of the main deck monsters can basically go into a Salamangreat Banelix. However, the problem with that occurs when, number one, if they normal summon something like a Ladybug or maybe even something like a Salamangreat Foxy, they won't be able to activate that effect. Then number two, if they do get the Banelix on field, they have to pick and choose. Do they want to go ahead and search that Salamangreat Sanctuary and just kind of be stuck on Banelix, or do they want to play one of those natural extenders, a card like Foul or maybe a Spinny from the hand, a Salamangreat Gazelle to special summon? Even if they do that and they're able to link climb into a Link 2, it's very unlikely with the monsters that Salamangreat currently plays in the extra deck that that monster is going to be big enough to beat over the Inspector Boulder anyways. That is, unless your opponent is 200 IQ and they run something like Flame Administrator, which I actually did run in Salamangreats way back in the day. But outside of that, if they're just playing this normal Nightmare Phoenix and Sunlight Wolf, those monsters are not going to be strong enough to beat over the border, so it's almost a moot point. Now, I will say this, I think that control decks do have a little bit of an easier time dealing with border, and that's because they do run some main deck outs. There are cards like Crackdown, Infinite Impermanence that can answer this card. However, it's more likely that these control decks are also going to be playing hand traps, and those cards are complete breaks against an Inspector border, so it's also a little bit of give and take. And we know that Salamangreat run a ton of hand traps. None of them are effective against an Inspector border that's already established on the field. Now, with all of this said, there are some problems with Inspector Border, and I will go ahead and address some of its flaws. Number one, while it does stomp combo decks, you do need to be going first, because if you go second against a combo deck, chances are your opponent's going to have a lot of extra deck monsters established on the field, and they will at that point be able to activate those ever important monster effects, and the card just really won't be that effective. Number two, there are not a lot of good ways to be able to get to this card outside of simply hard drawing it. I think that technically it's searchable by Cyber Emergency, don't quote me on that, but that is kind of like the only way to directly get to the card. And then number three, there are a couple of matchups that aren't particularly great. I know Pendulums don't have an issue at all being able to get over this card because they can Pendulum summon, and generally speaking, a lot of Pendulum decks can summon big monsters fairly easily. I know the Sky Striker matchup wasn't the greatest in the past, but I think that that has technically changed because Sky Strikers used to be able to have Widow Anchor and Afterburners to be able to out-inspect the border easily, but now they don't have Engage to search those cards, so the Sky Striker matchup might be okay, but Pendulums definitely will have no problem outing this card. Overall, I think Border is absolutely amazing. I do believe that there are a ton of matchups where if you're able to open with Border and normal summon it, you basically just win the game, unless your opponent has maybe one out in their entire deck, especially against combo. And I think it's a card that people should look at a lot more in this format. Anyways, whatever you guys think, leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already, and turn on that notification bell for daily videos.